It was supposed to be an ordinary night, the kind that leaves no mark on memory, the kind that blends into every other shift before it. The air was cool, heavy with the smell of damp earth and old concrete, and the sky hung low with clouds that swallowed the stars. Somewhere in the distance, a fence hummed softly with electricity, a constant reminder that this place existed to be guarded, even if no one quite remembered why anymore. They stepped out together just after midnight, two figures moving to the darkness with practiced ease, boots crunching lightly against gravel that had not been replaced in decades. Their patrol route was etched into muscle memory. Every turn, every blind spot, every stretch where the lights flickered and never got fixed. They didn't talk much. They never really did. Words felt unnecessary after so many nights spent walking the same perimeter, listening to the same wind scrape against metal walls. One of them checked his watch out of habit. Not because time mattered here, but because routine demanded it. The other adjusted his jacket, pulling it tighter around himself, as if the cold had suddenly found a way through the fabric. Neither of them noticed how quiet the place had become. Not the comforting quiet of a sleeping facility, but something deeper, a silence that felt held, as if the night itself were waiting. They had walked this path hundreds of times before, past the outer storage buildings, past the section of fencing that leaned inward like it was tired of standing, past the stretch where the ground dipped just enough to collect shadows even on bright days. This was a night patrol like any other. No alerts, no radio chatter, no sense of urgency. Just two men doing a job that rarely asked anything of them beyond presence. And then, without warning, the routine fractured, not with a sound, not with a flash of violence. There was no alarm screaming into the dark, no gunshot echoing off concrete walls, no desperate call crackling over the radio. Nothing dramatic enough to be remembered clearly later. Just absence, the kind that sneaks in quietly, only noticed after it is already settled. At 12:47 a.m., their radio check-in was due. It never came. At first, no one thought much of it. Radios failed all the time. Batteries died. Signals dropped in certain parts of the perimeter where old infrastructure interfered with transmission. Someone made a note in a logbook, assuming the patrol would check in at the next interval. The clock kept moving. The facility kept breathing in its slow, mechanical way. But the next check-in didn't come either. Minutes stretched, then half an hour, then longer. By the time concern replaced complacency, the night had thickened, and something unspoken had already taken root. A supervisor tried the radio again. Static answered back. A vehicle was dispatched along the patrol route, headlights cutting through the darkness, illuminating the familiar terrain in harsh white beams. They found the patrol vehicle first. It was parked exactly where it should not have been. Engine off, doors closed. No signs of struggle. No broken glass. No footprints leading away into the dirt. It looked less like something abandoned and more like something intentionally left behind, as if the men had simply stepped out, fully expecting to return in moments. They never did. Search teams arrived as the night bled into morning. Flashlights traced the ground, sweeping over gravel and grass, over rusted pipes and concrete barriers. Dogs were brought in, trained noses lowered to the earth, handlers holding their breath as if afraid to disturb whatever fragile trace remained. The dogs circled, hesitated, then stopped, not confused, not frantic, just still. It was as though the trail ended mid-step. By sunrise, the place looked different. Daylight stripped away the illusion of safety the darkness had provided, revealing cracks in walls, peeling warning signs, and structures that felt older than the purpose they once served. Yet even in the light, there was nothing. No blood, no torn fabric, no evidence that anything unusual had happened at all, which somehow made it worse. People like clear endings, even violent ones. What unsettled everyone wasn't that two men were gone, but that the night offered no explanation for how it happened. It was as if the facility itself had swallowed them without leaving a mark, as if the perimeter they were meant to protect had quietly turned inward. Hours turned into days, days into weeks. Official statements were careful, stripped of emotion and heavy with neutrality. The men were missing, Search efforts were ongoing. There was no indication of foul play at this time. Words chosen calm, not to explain. Families were notified with rehearsed sympathy, told that everything possible was being done, even as the search radius remained oddly small, constrained to areas that were already well known. At night, the guards who remained on duty avoided the patrol route where the men were last seen, not because they were told to, but because something about it felt wrong now. The darkness there seemed thicker, heavier, as if it remembered something no one else did. Radios crackled more often in that stretch, voices breaking into static without warning. The facility continued to operate. That was perhaps the most disturbing part. Whatever had happened did not disrupt operations. Schedules were maintained. Shifts were reassigned. Logbooks continued to fill with ink. The absence of two men was absorbed into bureaucracy with alarming efficiency. Their disappearance reduced to a line item, a procedural anomaly to be resolved or quietly forgotten. But nights have a way of holding on to things. Years later, people would still talk about that shift in hushed tones, about how ordinary it was, about how nothing felt wrong until suddenly everything was. They would say the men were experienced, cautious, unlikely to break protocol. They would say the facility had always had strange rules, unexplained restrictions, places marked off limits without clear reasons. They would say a lot of things. What no one could ever say was what truly happened between the moment the men stepped into the dark and the moment the dark failed to give them back. Because somewhere along that patrol route, between a routine check and an unanswered radio call, something unseen crossed a line. And once it did, the night closed behind them, leaving nothing but silence where two lives had been. It did not stand proudly on any highway sign or announce itself with fresh paint and clean glass. You wouldn't stumble across it by accident. The access road curved away from the nearest town like a thought you decide not to finish, narrowing as it went, its asphalt cracked and softened by decades of neglect. Trees pressed close on both sides, branches arching overhead until the road felt less like a route and more like a tunnel. By the time the facility came into view, most visitors had already forgotten what they expected to find. It sat low against the land, deliberately unremarkable. From a distance, the structures looked like warehouses that outlived their usefulness. Long, rectangular buildings with dull metal siding and windows too high and too narrow to invite curiosity. No signage explained their purpose. No flags marked allegiance or ownership. Even the perimeter fencing felt half-hearted, as if its primary function was to suggest security rather than enforce it. The message was subtle but clear. There is nothing here worth noticing. That was the lie. The facility had been built during a time when secrecy was considered a form of safety. Its origins were wrapped in language like temporary, contingency, and strategic necessity, words designed to avoid detail while implying importance. On paper, it existed for one reason. In practice, it adapted, evolving quietly as priorities shifted and administrations changed. What it did became less important than the fact that it continued to exist. Maps were unreliable where this place was concerned. Some showed it as a generic industrial site. Others omitted it entirely. The land rendered blank, as if the cartographer's pen had simply skipped over it. Even local residents struggled to explain what went on beyond the fence. They knew it was there, of course. They had always known. But knowing something exists is not the same as understanding it. Understanding invites questions. Questions invite attention. Inside the perimeter, the design favored confusion over clarity. Buildings were arranged in ways that defied logic. Corridors leading to dead ends, doors opening into spaces that felt disconnected from the rest of the complex. Some areas were brightly lit and meticulously maintained. Others were dim, dust settling undisturbed on surfaces no one seemed responsible for anymore. The inconsistency was intentional, though few could articulate why. People who worked there often described a strange sense of disorientation, especially in their early days. It wasn't that the layout was complex. It was that it resisted familiarity. Just when you thought you understood the rhythm of the place, something shifted. A hallway felt longer than it had yesterday. A door appeared where there hadn't been one before. An entire section seemed to fall out of use overnight, sealed with warnings that offered no explanation. The rules followed the same pattern. Some were strict to the point of obsession. Identification badges had to be worn at all times, even in empty corridors. Logs had to be completed in ink, never pencil. Certain areas required dual authorization to enter, even for routine maintenance. Other rules, however, were frustratingly vague. Avoid unnecessary presence. Report irregularities immediately. Do not linger. What constituted unnecessary presence was never defined. What qualified as an irregularity was left to interpretation. This ambiguity did more than frustrate employees. It trained them. Over time, people learned not to ask why. They learned which questions earned polite deflection and which earned uncomfortable silence. They learned that curiosity did not lead to answers, only to reassignment or worse, to being quietly encouraged to seek employment elsewhere. The facility did not punish dissent openly. It simply made it inconvenient. By the time the two patrolmen arrived there, the place was already in its twilight years. Officially, its importance had diminished. Budgets were cut, staff numbers reduced. Entire departments were consolidated or dissolved. The facility became a shadow of its former self, maintained more out of habit than necessity. And yet, certain systems remained fully operational. Certain sections remained restricted. Certain protocols were never relaxed. Night patrols existed largely to satisfy policy rather than necessity. The perimeter was secure. Trespassers were rare. Most nights passed without incident, the guards walking their routes in a kind of meditative boredom. The job demanded vigilance, but rewarded it with monotony. Still, the facility never fully slept. Even at its quietest, there was a low hum that seemed to rise from the ground itself. Ventilation systems cycled air through spaces no one could quite account for. Lights flickered in windows of buildings listed as inactive. Radios occasionally picked up interference that didn't match any known frequency. Bursts of static that sounded almost patterned, though no one could ever prove it. The land beneath the facility carried its own history, one that predated fences and concrete. Locals spoke of it cautiously, framing their stories as folklore rather than fact. They said the ground there had always been unsettled, prone to swallowing sound, distorting distance. Animals avoided it. Storms behaved strangely overhead, clouds lingering longer than they should. These stories were easy to dismiss, easier still to ignore. What mattered, officially, was that the place functioned, that guards showed up, that logs were filled, that the illusion of oversight remained intact. The facility did not need to be understood to be maintained. It only needed to be watched. And so it was watched. Night after night, guards traced the same routes, passing the same landmarks, learning the terrain not as a whole, but in fragments. A rusted gate here, a drainage culvert there, a patch of ground where the gravel gave way to packed earth for no apparent reason. Small details that meant nothing individually, but together formed a landscape that felt curated rather than accidental. It was in one of these overlooked spaces, neither prominent nor forbidden, that the patrol route dipped closer to the heart of the facility. Not by design, officially, just by necessity, the path bending around structures added long after the original plans were drawn. Few people realized how close that route came to sections that no longer appeared on any current blueprint. Fewer still understood why those sections had been removed. The facility's greatest strength was not its security, or its isolation, or even its secrecy. It was its ability to endure without explanation, to exist in a state of quiet contradiction, important but obsolete, active but forgotten. It trained everyone who passed through it to accept gaps in understanding as normal. So when two men vanished within its perimeter, the place absorbed that too. The buildings did not change. The fences did not fall. The lights continued to flicker on and off according to schedules set decades earlier. The facility remained what it had always been, a place designed not to draw attention, not to invite scrutiny, and not to give answers easily. It had been built to be forgotten, and in forgetting, it had learned how to keep secrets. Before they became names in a report, before they were reduced to timestamps and unanswered radio calls, they were just men trying to make sense of ordinary lives. One of them had a habit of waking before his alarm. Even on nights when his shift didn't start until late, His body refused to sleep in. He would lie there for a while, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet sounds of a house that no longer felt new but still didn't feel permanent. His coffee mug always sat in the same place on the counter, chipped along the rim from a drop years earlier. He liked it that way. Familiar, reliable, things that didn't change without warning. He didn't talk much about work at home, not because it was classified, but because there was nothing to say. He walked. He checked gates. He filled out logs. When asked how his night went, he usually answered with a shrug and a half smile, as if the question itself were more effort than the answer. The job paid the bills. It allowed him to plan. That was enough. The other man was different in quieter ways. He kept a notebook in his jacket pocket, its pages bent and smudged from being carried everywhere. Sometimes he wrote grocery lists in it, sometimes half-formed thoughts, sometimes nothing at all, just lines drawn absent-mindedly during long nights. He told himself he would stop carrying it once it fell apart, but it never quite did. It felt like proof that his thoughts existed somewhere outside his head. He called his sister every Sunday without fail. The conversations followed a predictable rhythm. Updates about work, complaints about the weather, vague plans that were never finalized. But beneath the routine was something unspoken, a shared understanding that these calls mattered more than either of them admitted. He always ended them the same way, promising to visit soon, even when he knew his schedule wouldn't allow it. They weren't close friends, not in the way people imagine partners on night patrol to be. They didn't share secrets or talk about their dreams. Their bond was practical, built on shared responsibility and mutual trust. Each knew the other would show up. Each knew the other wouldn't cut corners when it mattered. That was enough. On shift, they moved in a quiet synchronization that only comes from repetition. One walked slightly ahead, scanning the fence line, the other trailing just far enough back to watch their surroundings. They rarely discussed the route. They didn't need to. Their conversations, when they happened, drifted toward the mundane. Complaints about malfunctioning equipment, jokes about management decisions that made no sense, passing remarks about how cold it felt that night. There were moments, though, when the silence stretched longer than usual. In those moments, each man retreated into his own thoughts. One thought about the future in practical terms, repairs that needed to be done around the house, money that needed to be set aside, the slow accumulation of responsibilities that defined adulthood. The other thought in fragments, memories from childhood, songs he couldn't quite remember the words to, the vague sense that he had missed some unnamed opportunity and wasn't sure when. Neither of them spoke about the unease the facility sometimes inspired. It wasn't fear exactly, more like a persistent awareness that some places were never meant to feel comfortable, that the rules here were shaped by something other than logic. They felt it most strongly during night patrols, when the world narrowed to the beam of a flashlight and the crunch of gravel underfoot, when shadows pulled in corners that seemed too deep for their size. But discomfort, like routine, is something people learn to live with. To the administration, they were reliable employees. Their files were unremarkable. No disciplinary actions. No commendations worth noting. Just steady attendance and satisfactory performance reviews. The kind of workers who blend into background, who make systems function without ever drawing attention to themselves. At home, their absence left spaces that could not be immediately named. A chair remained empty at the kitchen table. A voicemail went unanswered. A jacket stayed hanging by the door, pockets still holding whatever had been carried on that final night. Loved ones moved through these spaces carefully at first, as if afraid that acknowledging the emptiness might make it permanent. In the early days after the disappearance, families replayed their last conversations endlessly, searching for meaning in casual remarks, wondering if a pause, a sigh, or an offhand comment had been a warning they failed to recognize. One remembered how tired he had sounded. The other fixated on how he had said goodbye more softly than usual. Grief does strange things of memory. The men were described differently depending on who you asked. Responsible, quiet, thoughtful, stubborn, kind. Each description was true in its own way, incomplete on its own. Together, they formed a picture of people who existed fully, even if they never demanded to be seen. Their disappearance transformed them into symbols they never asked to be. They became the missing guards, the unsolved case, the incident management wanted to forget. Their individuality blurred as their story was retold. Details smoothed over to fit official narratives. The things that had once defined them, the chipped mug, the battered notebook, were never mentioned in reports. What remained was absence. Over time, that absence grew heavier, not sharper, not more painful in an obvious way, but more ingrained. It settled into daily life, altering routines subtly. Meals were cooked in smaller portions. Phones were checked less often. Plans were made with an unspoken asterisk, an acknowledgement that some things might never be resolved. For those who loved them, the lack of answers was its own form of cruelty. There was no body to mourn, no grave to visit, no final moment to anchor their grief, just a question mark that stretched on indefinitely, reshaping the way they understood loss. They learned to live with the idea that closure was not guaranteed. In quiet moments, some wondered if the men had sensed something that night, if there had been a moment of hesitation, a glance exchanged between them, a feeling they couldn't quite explain, or if they had walked forward as they always did, trusting the routine that had never failed them before. That trust, in the end, was what made their stories so unsettling. They were not reckless. They were not careless. They did not wander where they shouldn't have. They followed the path laid out for them, did the job as it was assigned, and disappeared anyway, which raised a question no report could answer. If men like them could vanish without a trace, what did that say about the place they were guarding? And what did it say about the systems that allowed their lives to be reduced to an unresolved file, quietly aging in a cabinet somewhere, while the world moved on? In remembering who they were, in holding on to the small details that never made it into official records, one truth became impossible to ignore. They were not just missing from the facility. They were missing from the story that was told about that night. Within hours of the missed check-ins being formally acknowledged, procedures were activated. Phones rang. Forms were filled. Names were entered into systems designed to track deviations from the expected order of things. The language used was precise and reassuring. A routine escalation. A standard search. Everything unfolding exactly as protocol dictated. In practice, the effort felt strangely hollow. Search teams were assembled and dispatched, but their movements followed predictable patterns, as if guided more by habit than urgency. Flashlights swept the ground along established paths, illuminating the same familiar stretches again and again. Areas already well known were examined meticulously, while others, less defined, more ambiguous, were approached with visible hesitation or avoided entirely. From the outside, it looked thorough. From within, it felt constrained. The initial assumption was mechanical failure. Radios malfunction. Vehicles stall. People miscommunicate. These explanations were comforting because they suggested solutions. Fix the equipment. Adjust the schedule. Move on. But as each possibility was tested and dismissed, the investigation should have deepened. Instead, it stalled. Logs were reviewed and re-reviewed. The patrol vehicle was examined for signs of tampering or damage. There was none. Its fuel tank was full. The keys were still in the ignition, turned just far enough to power the radio. Even the radio itself showed no sign of distress, no record of an interrupted transmission that might suggest panic. It was as if the men had stepped away mid-thought. Supervisors spoke in calm, measured tones, urging patience. They reminded everyone that disappearances were rare, but not unheard of. People got lost. People made mistakes. They suggested the men might have wandered off-route, perhaps chasing perceived anomaly or investigating a noise. The idea lingered, unsupported by evidence, but useful in shifting focus away from the facility itself. When questioned about certain restricted areas, responses became less specific. Those sections were inactive, they said, unrelated, already cleared. The explanations were brief, final. Any attempt to push further was met with polite deflection. There was an unspoken understanding that some doors were not meant to be opened, even metaphorically. Families were updated regularly at first. They were told the search was ongoing, that resources were being allocated, that optimism remained. Each call followed a script, its tone carefully calibrated to balance concern with reassurance. But as days passed without progress, the calls grew shorter, less frequent. Updates became vague, padded with procedural language that conveyed movement without meaning. Behind closed doors, frustration simmered. Some personnel genuinely wanted answers. They questioned inconsistencies, pointed out gaps in the timeline, noted how certain camera feeds were unavailable during critical windows. Their concerns were acknowledged, documented, and quietly set aside, not dismissed outright, just deprioritized. The case began to change shape. What had started as an urgent search slowly transformed into an administrative problem. How long do you search when there is nothing to follow? How many resources do you commit to an absence? At what point does the effort itself become more disruptive than the mystery it seeks to resolve? These questions were never asked aloud, but they guided decisions nonetheless. Paperwork multiplied. Reports grew thicker, their language increasingly cautious. Each new document referenced the last, creating a loop of self-validation that made it seem as though progress was being made. In reality, the investigation was circling itself, unable or unwilling to break outward. Outside agencies were notified, but their involvement remained limited. Jurisdictional boundaries were cited. Cooperation was offered in principle, constrained in practice. The facility's unique status complicated matters, placing it in a gray zone where accountability diffused easily. And then there were the cameras. Security footage existed, but not in the way people expected. Some cameras covered entrances and major corridors, their recordings clear and uneventful. Others, particularly those along the patrol route, suffered from maintenance issues. Gaps appeared in the footage at critical times, attributed to outdated systems or power fluctuations. The explanations were plausible. Too plausible. When asked why these systems had not been upgraded, the answer was always the same: budgetary constraints, low priority, no previous incidents to justify the expense. The absence of visual evidence became another layer of silence. As weeks passed, search efforts officially scaled back. This decision was framed as strategic, a reallocation of resources to more productive avenues. Unofficially, it was an acknowledgement that the investigation had reached a point where further effort might reveal more than intended. Families sensed a shift immediately. They felt it in the tone of conversations, in the way officials avoided eye contact, in the careful phrasing that left room for interpretation without offering clarity. Hope, once actively encouraged, was now something families were expected to manage on their own. Some pushed back. They asked questions. They demanded transparency. Their persistence was met with sympathy, but little else. The system had answered prepared for grief, not for doubt. Internally, the case was reassigned. New personnel reviewed old files, their distance allowing them to see patterns others had missed, or perhaps to overlook them more easily. Fresh eyes brought fresh interpretations, but always within the same narrow framework. The possibility that the facility itself played a role was never formally entertained. It was easier to assume human error than institutional complicity. Eventually, the language shifted. The men were no longer missing. They were presumed lost, presumed dead, presumed beyond recovery. This linguistic transition allowed the case to move toward closure without resolution. It created space for operations to continue without the constant reminder of unresolved disappearance. But the investigation never truly ended. It simply receded. Files were archived, not closed. They were stored in a way that suggested future access without inviting it. A record of effort, carefully curated, ready to be referenced if necessary, but unlikely to be reopened. For those who remained at the facility, the disappearance became a cautionary tale told indirectly. New guards were trained with an emphasis on protocol, on staying within designated areas, on reporting irregularities without attempting to resolve them alone. The lesson was clear, even if it was never stated outright. Do your job. Do not deviate. Do not ask too much. The investigation had gone nowhere, but in doing so, it had reinforced the very boundaries that made answers impossible. And so the case settled into its final form, not as a solved mystery, but as a controlled one. A disappearance acknowledged just enough to maintain the appearance of accountability, contained just enough to prevent disruption. The night the men vanished remained officially unexplained. Unofficially, it was something else entirely. It was a reminder that some questions are not unanswered because they lack answers, but because the answers threaten the structure built to contain them. It started quietly, in conversations that ended when someone new entered the room, in glances exchanged across counters at late-night diners, in pauses that stretched just long enough to suggest there was more to say, but not enough courage to say it. The disappearance left a vacuum, and into that space crept stories, unfinished, unverified, but impossible to ignore. People who lived near the facility had always carried a low-level awareness of it, like background noise you stopped consciously hearing. After patrol vanished, that awareness sharpened. The fence no longer felt like a boundary. It felt like a warning. Locals began to revisit things they had once dismissed as quirks or coincidence. Someone remembered being told, years earlier, never to hike too close to the perimeter, even though there were no signs posted. Another recalled how certain roads were plowed in winter, while others, equally used, were left untouched. A former contractor spoke about being escorted through sections that didn't appear on his work orders, corridors he was told not to look down, doors he was instructed never to ask about. None of these accounts were dramatic on their own. That was what made them unsettling. They felt ordinary, almost banal, the kind of strange details that accumulate slowly and only reveal their shape in hindsight. The first rumor to take hold was simple. The men had seen something they weren't supposed to see. It was an explanation that felt intuitive, even if it lacked specifics. People speculated about unauthorized activity, about equipment being stored off the books, about experiments long abandoned but never fully dismantled. The details changed depending on who was telling the story, but the core idea remained the same. The patrol crossed an invisible line. Officially, this theory was dismissed without comment. There was nothing unusual at the facility, nothing that could justify such speculation. Unofficially, the silence spoke louder than any denial could have. Then came the stories about sound. Several guards claimed that on certain nights, radios picked up faint transmissions that didn't match any known channel. Not voices exactly, more like patterns of interference that repeated at irregular intervals. These claims had been logged before the disappearance, categorized as technical anomalies. Afterward, they were quietly discouraged from being reported. Others talked about footsteps, not the echo of one's own boots, which every guard learned to distinguish early on, but something just out of sync, a half-second delay, a rhythm that didn't quite match. These stories were always told with a self-conscious laugh, as if the speaker needed to distance themselves from their own words. No one wanted to sound superstitious. No one wanted to admit unease. But unease lingered. Among locals, an older explanation resurfaced, one that predated the facility entirely. They spoke of the land as if it had always been wrong somehow, of sinkholes that appeared and disappeared without warning, of areas where compasses spun uselessly, of livestock that refused to graze in certain patches, no matter how lush the grass appeared. These tales were usually shared as folklore, passed down and softened over time. But now, they were told differently, with purpose, as if the disappearance had granted them new relevance. The most persistent rumor centered on a specific stretch of the patrol route. It was a place with no official designation, no warning signs, nothing to distinguish it from the rest of the perimeter. Yet multiple people recall being told, informally, to move through that area quickly, not to linger, not to stop. No reason was ever given. After the patrol vanished, some claimed that this was where they were last seen. Others insisted the men had radioed in from just beyond it, though no such transmission existed in the logs. The lack of evidence didn't weaken the rumor, it strengthened it. Absence became proof of suppression. Then there was the explanation that would, for decades, be treated as the official unofficial truth. The men had deserted. It was suggested gently at first, framed as a possibility rather than an accusation. Perhaps they had planned it. Perhaps financial troubles or personal issues had driven them to leave everything behind. The lack of a struggle supported the idea. The untouched vehicle, the quiet departure. For those who knew them, this explanation rang hollow. They were not men who vanished impulsively. They did not leave debts unresolved, loved ones uninformed, lives mid-motion. Yet the theory persisted, repeated often enough to gain weight through familiarity. It was a convenient answer, one that placed responsibility squarely on the missing, absolving the system that had lost them. Over time, this version of events became embedded in public consciousness. It appeared in brief mentions and summaries, in conversations with a hint of finality. The men had chosen to leave. The case was tragic, but ultimately self-contained. There was no need to look further. But rumors have a way of resisting containment. Years later, a retired guard would admit, in a moment of unexpected candor, that the desertion theory had been encouraged, not explicitly, not in writing, but through tone and emphasis. It was an answer that leadership did not correct. And in that silence, permission was granted. Other whispers pointed towards something more procedural, that the disappearance was a result of a drill gone wrong, that the men had been used, knowingly or not, to test response times, containment protocols, or human behavior under stress. These ideas were never supported by evidence, but they reflected a growing suspicion that the truth, whatever it was, had been deemed unacceptable for public release. In private, families heard things they were never meant to, offhand comments from officials who spoke too freely, hints dropped and quickly retracted, a suggestion that some doors, once open, could not be closed again. These moments were fleeting, easily denied, but they lingered, deepening the sense that the story everyone was being told was incomplete. The first lie was not a single statement. It was a posture, a collective agreement to present certainty where none existed, to favor explanations that required no further inquiry. It was the insistence that nothing unusual had occurred, even as evidence failed to support that claim. It was a quiet discouragement of curiosity, the subtle framing of questions as inconvenience. As rumors multiplied, so did the effort to manage them. Conversations were redirected. Local reporters found their access limited. Stories that strayed too far from the accepted narrative failed to gain traction. Over time, the mystery dulled, not because it was solved, but because it was crowded out by newer, more immediate concerns. Yet beneath the surface, the whispers endured. They were passed down, reshaped by memory, altered by fear and imagination. Each retelling added a layer, not necessarily of truth, but of emotional weight. The disappearance became more than an unsolved case. It became a symbol of something unacknowledged, something deliberately left in shadow. And in that shadow, the first lie continued to do its work, not by convincing everyone of a falsehood, but by ensuring that no single truth could ever fully take hold. Time did what it always does. It kept moving, indifferent to the questions left behind. The facility remained. Shifts were filled. Patrol routes were walked by new boots that learned the same rhythms, the same shortcuts, the same places where the light didn't quite reach. The disappearance of two men became a reference point rather than a crisis. A before and after that only mattered to those who remembered the moment when it was still new. For everyone else, it faded into background noise. Years passed in quiet increments. Calendars flipped. Policies were updated. The names of the missing were mentioned less frequently, then only when paperwork demanded it. Their case was no longer active in any meaningful sense, but it was never resolved either. It existed in a suspended state, neither alive nor laid to rest. Families learned how to survive in that space. In the beginning, they had lived between phone calls, between updates that never quite said anything. Later, they learned to live between anniversaries. Each year brought the same questions, the same hollow reassurances, the same reminder that time had done nothing to clarify what had happened. Grief became something quieter, less explosive but more enduring. They learned which days were hardest. Birthdays passed with a forced normalcy that felt dishonest. Holidays arrived carrying an extra weight, an empty chair that no one acknowledged directly. Photographs remained on shelves, never removed, never explained. It was easier to let absence exist than to try to define it. Some held on to hope longer than others. Hope that the men had chosen a different life. Hope that they were alive somewhere, unable or unwilling to return. Hope that one day a call would come, or a letter, or any sign that would transform the uncertainty into something solid. That hope dimmed slowly, not through any single revelation, but through exhaustion. Uncertainty is heavy when carried alone. As years passed, the world outside the mystery changed in ways that made it feel increasingly distant. Technology advanced. New systems replaced old ones. Younger guards joined the facility with no memory of the disappearance beyond a brief mention during training. To them, it was history, not trauma. The patrol route was adjusted slightly, rerouted around construction projects and security updates. The place where the men were last known to be became less accessible, then functionally irrelevant. Without intention, the physical landscape of the mystery began to erode. What remained was emotional geography. Among those who had worked there at the time, the disappearance was rarely discussed openly. It was acknowledged in subtle ways: an extra check-in during night patrols, a pause before entering certain areas, a shared look when radios crackled unexpectedly. No one needed to explain what they were thinking. The mystery lived in these moments, unspoken but present. For the families, time did not bring clarity, but it did bring a kind of numbness. The sharp edge of fear softened into a dull ache. They stopped expecting answers, but they never stopped noticing the absence. It became part of their identity, shaping how they understood loss, trust, and the idea of closure. Some tried to move on in visible ways. Houses were sold. Jobs were changed. New routines were built, fragile at first, then sturdy with repetition. Life, after all, has a way of insisting on itself. Even unresolved grief must coexist with daily obligations. Others remained anchored to the question. They reread old reports. They requested files, only to receive heavily redacted documents that offered nothing new. They connected with each other, forming a quiet network bound not by hope of resolution, but by shared understanding. Together, they kept the memory alive, even as the world forgot. The disappearance became something people referenced in the past tense, even though it was never truly over. Locally, it shifted into legend. New residents heard about it secondhand, framed as a strange thing that happened long ago. Details blurred. Dates were misremembered. The men became less real, more symbolic. Their story was told to evoke unease rather than empathy, a reminder that some places carry histories that resist explanation. Over time, the mystery hardened, not into truth, but into permanence. It became one of those unresolved stories that people assume will never be answered, a curiosity rather than a wound. The lack of resolution no longer shocked anyone. It simply existed, a fact of the narrative. Yet even as time moved on, certain questions refused to fade. Why had the investigation narrowed so quickly? Why had some areas remained off-limits long after their supposed decommissioning? Why had the facility maintained protocols that no longer made sense? These questions surface occasionally, only to be gently redirected or left unanswered. Time did not erase them. It only made them easier to ignore. Then, decades later, something shifted. Not dramatically, not publicly. A small bureaucratic action, routine, almost invisible, set things in motion. A survey was commissioned, an assessment ordered. The kind of administrative process that happens quietly, without awareness of the history it might disturb. Most people involved had no idea what they were about to encounter. For those who still carried the weight of the disappearance, the passage of time had created a strange tension. The longer the mystery endured, the more impossible resolution seemed. Answers, if they came, would arrive too late to matter in the ways that once felt important. And yet, the questions remained. Time had not healed them. It had simply layered life on top, like dust on a sealed door. The story waited beneath, unchanged, patient, waiting for the moment when forgetting would finally fail. The discovery did not happen the way revelations usually do. There was no dramatic announcement, no sudden realization that sent people running. It began as paperwork, as so many things do, a routine structural assessment, mandated by updated regulations that had nothing to do with disappearances or history. The facility was old, older than many of the systems now responsible for overseeing it. An evaluation was overdue, and overdue things eventually get addressed, not out of curiosity, but out of obligation. Engineers arrived with clipboards and measuring tools, their interest purely practical. They were there to assess load-bearing walls, subsurface integrity, drainage systems that had been patched too many times to count. They were not looking for secrets. They were looking for weaknesses. At first, everything aligned with expectations. Concrete tested within acceptable limits. Reinforcements noted, aging but intact. Then one reading came back wrong. It was subtle, a density anomaly beneath a section of ground that, according to current schematics, should have been unremarkable. No listed structures, no utilities, just earth. The numbers didn't match that assumption. The ground was denser than it should have been, layered in a way that suggested deliberate construction rather than natural formation. The finding was flagged, almost absent-mindedly. Follow-up scans were ordered, still framed within the language of safety and maintenance. Perhaps an undocumented foundation. Perhaps remnants of an old support structure that had never been removed from the records. These things happened, especially in facilities that had changed hands and purposes over decades. But the scans told a different story. Beneath the soil lay straight lines, angles too precise to be incidental. A hollow space, sealed, reinforced, and completely absent from every map, blueprint, and digital archive currently in use. Whatever it was, it had been built intentionally, and then erased just as intentionally. The atmosphere shifted, not overtly. No one said anything dramatic, but the tone of emails changed. Conversations grew more careful. The anomaly was no longer a footnote. It became a subject, one discussed in smaller groups, behind closed doors. Questions arose about authorization, about jurisdiction, about whether this finding needed to be reported beyond the immediate chain of command. Eventually, permission was granted to investigate further. It was framed as due diligence, an obligation to ensure the integrity of the facility. No reference was made to history, to disappearances, to anything beyond structural necessity. Still, those involved felt a quiet tension settle over the process, an unspoken sense that they were approaching something not meant to be revisited. The entrance was not obvious. There was no hatch, no visible door. The bunker, though no one used that word at first, had been concealed beneath layers of poured concrete and compacted soil, disguised as part of the natural grading of the land. It took days of careful excavation to expose the top of the structure, and even then, it revealed nothing more than a smooth, unmarked surface. No labels, no warnings, no identifying features. Just concrete. It was thicker than modern standards required, reinforced in ways that suggested concern not just with stability, but with containment. This was not a structure designed for convenience or temporary use. It was built to last, and more importantly, to stay closed. The first breach was cautious. A small access point was drilled, just enough to insert a camera. The footage that came back was grainy, distorted by dust and darkness, but it was enough. A corridor, narrow, lined with metal conduits that had long since gone cold. The air inside was still undisturbed, as if the space had been holding its breath for decades. That was when the language changed. This was no longer a maintenance issue. This was a discovery. Specialists were brought in quietly. Not announced, not advertised. Their presence was explained to staff as part of ongoing upgrades. The fewer people who knew the details, the better. Curiosity, after all, had a way of spreading. When the entrance was finally opened fully, the first thing that struck those who entered was the smell. Not decay, not mold, something flatter. Stale, like air that had been recycled too many times and then left untouched. The kind of smell that clings to places that were once occupied but never properly emptied. Lights were brought in, their beams cutting through darkness that had not been interrupted since the structure was sealed. Dust rose and hung suspended, slow to settle, as if even gravity moved differently down there. The bunker extended farther than anyone expected. Corridors branched off at deliberate angles, leading to rooms that varied in size and purpose. Some contained nothing but empty shelves bolted to the walls. Others housed equipment long obsolete, its function unclear without context. Wiring ran through the ceilings, neatly bundled, labeled with codes no one immediately recognized. There were signs of human presence, footprints preserved in dust, chairs positioned not randomly but thoughtfully, A table bolted to the floor, its surface scarred by use. These were not the remnants of hurried construction or temporary storage. This place had been lived in, worked in, perhaps even planned for extended occupancy. What was most unsettling was how intact it all was. Time had passed, but not intruded. The bunker had been sealed in a way that protected it from the slow erosion that claimed everything above ground. It existed in a pocket of arrested decay, a snapshot preserved beneath layers of indifference. As the exploration continued, unease deepened. There were no obvious identifiers, no plaques, no mission statements, no documentation left in plain view. Whatever this place was, it was not designed to explain itself to outsiders. Its purpose was meant to be known only by those who already understood it. Then someone noticed the doors. Not the main access point, but interior doors, heavy, reinforced, equipped with manual locking mechanisms. Some were open, others were closed. All of them were numbered, not sequentially, but according to a system that suggested categorization rather than navigation. Behind one door, they found a small room with no furniture at all, just bare walls, reinforced corners, and a drain in the center of the floor. Behind another, a space lined with sound-dampening material, its walls padded in a way that suggested an intention to suppress noise rather than echo it. No one said it aloud, but the implication was clear. This was not a shelter. The deeper they went, the harder it became to reconcile the bunker with the official history of the facility. There was no record of such a structure being commissioned, no budget line item, no archive correspondence authorizing its construction. It existed entirely outside the narrative everyone had accepted. And then they found the staircase. It led down another level, smaller than the first, more tightly controlled. Fewer rooms, thicker walls. The air felt heavier there, as if the space itself resisted intrusion. At the bottom of the stairs, a corridor ended abruptly at a sealed door. This one was different. Unlike the others, it bore markings, faded, almost erased, but still visible if you knew where to look. Warnings, perhaps, or classifications. The symbols were unfamiliar, their meaning unclear, but their presence suggested a heightened level of importance. It took hours to open. When it finally gave way, the room beyond was empty, completely empty. No equipment, no furniture, no obvious function. Just a space, larger than expected, its walls pristine compared to the rest of the bunker. It looked unused, untouched, as if it had been prepared for something that never happened, or something that had been removed. The silence there was profound. Standing in that room, it became impossible to maintain the fiction that this discovery was unrelated to the past. The bunker had not been forgotten by accident. It had been hidden deliberately, and then sealed away so thoroughly that even memory had failed to reach it. Above ground, the facility continued to operate as it always had. Shifts changed. Radios crackled. Logs were filled. Below ground, the truth waited. Not revealed all at once, not explained neatly, but present in concrete and steel and absence. A hidden structure, buried beneath decades of denial, finally exposed not by intention, but by time's quiet insistence. The ground had given up its secret, and in doing so, it reopened a story everyone thought was over. Understanding the bunker did not come all at once. It resisted interpretation the same way it had resisted discovery. Every answer uncovered seemed to generate two more questions, each more unsettling than the last. At first, investigators tried to categorize it using familiar frameworks. Emergency shelter, storage facility, decommission operations hub. None of those explanations held for long. The layout told a different story. This was not a place designed to protect people from an external threat. There were no signs of long-term habitation, no sleeping quarters, no food storage, no sanitation systems capable of supporting sustained occupancy. The rooms were too controlled, too segmented, too intentionally isolated from one another. This was a structure built not for survival, but for management of what exactly was harder to say. The equipment offered clues, though they were frustratingly incomplete. Consoles with missing components, panels labeled in outdated terminology that didn't correspond to any current system, manual overrides that suggested autonomy, the ability to operate independently from the facility above. Whatever function this bunker served, it was not meant to rely on outside input once activated. Some of the technology appeared observational in nature. Mounts for cameras or sensors lined certain corridors, angled not toward entrances, but inward, focused on the rooms themselves. Wiring suggested monitoring rather than communication. This was a place where things were watched, recorded, measured. The absence of screens or storage devices hinted that data was either transmitted elsewhere or removed entirely when the bunker was sealed. Other elements suggested containment. Walls were layered with materials chosen not just for strength, but for insulation, thermal, acoustic, electromagnetic. Doors sealed tightly, their frames reinforced beyond necessity. Ventilation systems that filtered air aggressively, cycling it through layers of containment before release. The design prioritized separation, control, and silence. Taken together, the message became clearer. This bunker was not defensive. It was preventative. It existed to isolate something deemed unacceptable for the surface world. Not necessarily dangerous in explosive sense, but disruptive. Something that required monitoring, regulation, perhaps suppression. The language of the structure spoke not of emergency response, but of risk management. Risk of what? Documents, when they were finally found, did little to comfort. They were stored not in filing cabinets or digital systems, but sealed within metal containers bolted to the walls. Many were damaged by time, their ink faded, their pages brittle. Others were deliberately redacted, entire sections blacked out long before age could touch them. What remained were fragments, terminology without definitions, references to protocols without context, dates without events. But certain phrases repeated: exposure threshold, operational silence, personnel isolation. The language was clinical, detached, stripped of emotion. It treated human presence as a variable to be controlled rather than a constant to be protected. Reading to the fragments felt less like uncovering a secret and more like overhearing part of conversation never meant to be complete. One document, dated decades earlier, stood out. It referenced the bunker obliquely, never naming it directly, but describing a subsurface operational environment designed to function outside standard oversight. Authorization was implied, not cited. Responsibility was diffuse, assigned to a committee that no longer existed under that name. The language suggested urgency at the time of writing, a sense that something had required immediate action, bypassing conventional review. Whatever problem the bunker was meant to address, it had not waited for permission. As more pieces fell into place, a pattern emerged. The facility above ground had changed roles many times over the years. Its mission statements evolved. Its departments were reorganized. Yet certain restrictions never lifted. Certain areas remained controlled long after their stated purpose expired. Those controls now made sense. They were not remnants of old policy. They were safeguards. The bunker was a constant beneath it all. A hidden foundation, not just physical but conceptual. It allowed the facility to present one face to the world while concealing another entirely. Above ground, everything appeared routine, bureaucratic, even dull. Below ground, the architecture told a story of fear, secrecy, and preemptive control. What unsettled investigators most was not what they found, but what they didn't. There were no clear records of when the bunker stopped being used. No decommissioning orders. No documentation explaining why it had been sealed rather than dismantled. This absence suggested that whatever had taken place there did not end cleanly. It was not resolved. It was simply contained. And containment, by its nature, implies persistence. The idea that the bunker had once been active reframed everything. The odd rules, the inconsistent layouts, the unexplained restrictions. They were not relics of outdated thinking. They were accommodations. Adjustments made to coexist with something hidden just beneath the surface. This realization cast the disappearance of patrol in a different light. If the bunker existed outside official narratives, then encountering it, intentionally or not, would have posed a problem. Not because the men were in danger from the structure itself, but because their awareness of it represented a breach. Knowledge, in this context, was not neutral. It was a liability. The bunker's design supported this interpretation. There were no signs of panic within its walls. No damage suggesting a struggle. No evidence of sudden abandonment. Instead, everything pointed to controlled activity. Procedures followed. Spaces used as intended. Whatever occurred, there was not chaotic. It was managed. This raised a chilling possibility. The disappearance may not have been an accident or an act of violence. It may have been a process, one that had been designed long before the men ever set foot on their patrol route. Investigators began to notice how the bunker's location aligned with subtle deviations in the patrol paths above, routes that curved inexplicably, areas where guards were instructed not to linger. The proximity was not obvious unless you knew what lay beneath, but once seen, it was impossible to ignore. The patrol had passed closer to the bunker than anyone realized, and perhaps, without knowing it, they had crossed a threshold. The bunker was not hidden because it was dangerous in conventional sense. It was hidden because its existence contradicted the narrative of oversight, safety, and accountability the facility relied on. It represented a space where different rules applied, where decisions could be made without scrutiny. In that space, responsibility dissolved. No single person could be blamed for what happened there. No clear chain of command could be traced. The system itself became the actor, diffuse and unaccountable. This diffusion was not accidental. It was a feature. The more investigators understood this, the clearer it became why the bunker had been erased from records, not to protect the public, but to protect the structure of authority that allowed it to exist. The bunker was a reminder of a time when urgency overrode ethics, when secrecy was considered a virtue, and when the consequences of containment were deferred indefinitely. It was never meant to be revisited, because revisiting it required acknowledging that certain decisions had been made without regard for the people they might affect. Standing within its walls, it was impossible not to think of patrol, of two men walking a route they walked countless times before, unaware that beneath their feet lay a space built for erasure, a place designed to make things disappear. Not violently, not dramatically, but quietly, efficiently, and without record. The bunker did not explain what happened to them, but it explained how something like that could happen at all. It was the missing context, the hidden logic that made the past suddenly coherent. The truth it revealed was not singular or satisfying. It did not resolve the mystery so much as deepen it, replacing one unknown with more troubling understanding. The facility had not failed the men. It had functioned exactly as designed. The records were not meant to survive. That much was clear the moment they were found. They were tucked away in a narrow compartment behind a removable panel, the kind of hiding place designed for things that might be needed briefly and then erased. Time had not been kind to them. Pages stuck together, edges curled and darkened, ink bleeding into the paper until words blurred into suggestion rather than certainty. But enough remained to tell a story no one had ever intended to be read again. These were patrol logs, not the official ones filed above ground, sanitized and predictable, but internal records, redundant, unofficial, meant to exist as a backup and then disappear. The timestamps immediately stood out. They extended beyond the moment when the men were reported missing. Minutes, then hours, long after the last acknowledged radio check-in. At first, investigators assumed an error. Clocks drift. Systems desynchronize. It was tempting to dismiss the discrepancy as technical failure, but the entries followed a pattern too deliberate to ignore. Each timestamp was consistent, precise, aligned with the bunker's internal systems rather than the facility's main network. Whatever recorded these logs was functioning independently, insulated from the failures above. The language used was unsettling in its restraint. There were no descriptions of fear, no expressions of confusion, just observations, movements noted, positions logged, environmental conditions recorded with clinical detachment. It read less like a diary and more like a monitoring report, as if the men themselves had become subjects rather than authors. One entry referenced a transition point. The phrase appeared without explanation, followed by a notation indicating restricted visibility and reduced signal transmission. Another entry marked compliance confirmed, though with no indication of who or what had been complied with. The passive voice dominated, responsibility carefully absent. Most disturbing were the gaps. Not long stretches of missing time, but brief silences, intervals where nothing was recorded at all. These gaps were consistent, repeating at regular intervals, as if something interrupted the process momentarily before allowing it to continue. The pattern suggested interference, not malfunction. The final entry was the hardest to read. It contained no words beyond a timestamp and a single designation, status unresolved. No closure, no conclusion, just an acknowledgement that whatever process had been underway had reached a point beyond documentation. There were no names attached to these logs, no signatures, no initials, only identifiers that corresponded to systems, not people. The men were present only as data points, their existence reduced to variables moving through a controlled environment. The realization settled slowly, heavily. The patrol had not simply vanished. According to these records, they had remained present, contained, observed, and logged longer than anyone had ever admitted. Their disappearance was not instantaneous. It was extended, managed, and then quietly sealed away. The logs ended, but the silence they left behind felt louder than anything written. Whatever happened next was never recorded. Or if it was, those records did not survive. Developer mode. The truth, when it finally surfaced, did not arrive as a confession or a single damning document. It emerged in fragments, in the negative space between records, in patterns that only made sense once everything else had been stripped away. There was no villain to point to, no moment of malice that could be isolated and condemned. What remained was something far more unsettling. It had been a decision, not made in a single room, not signed by a single hand, but distributed across committees, protocols, and contingencies. A choice embedded in policy, insulated by language and protected by distance. The kind of decision that feels abstract when it is made, because its consequences are deferred and its victims unnamed. The bunker had been authorized under a doctrine that no longer officially existed. Its purpose was framed as precautionary, a safeguard against variables that could not be publicly acknowledged. It operated under an assumption that certain risks justified extraordinary measures, and that those measures, once enacted, did not require continued oversight. Human presence was treated as incidental. If someone encountered what they were not meant to encounter, the system did not ask why. It did not evaluate intent or context. It responded the way it had been designed to respond, by isolating the variable, containing the breach, and preserving operational silence. The patrol had become such a variable. They did not trigger alarms because nothing went wrong. The system functioned as intended. Their proximity to the bunker, their awareness of something outside the approved narrative, constituted a risk under the logic that governed that space. What followed was not punishment, but procedure. This was the truth no one had been meant to find. The men were not taken in anger. They were not eliminated in secrecy. They were absorbed into a process that prioritized continuity over humanity. Once contained, their status ceased to matter in human terms. They were no longer guards, partners, sons, or brothers. They were unresolved inputs in a closed system. Responsibility dissolved upward. By the time anyone could have intervened, no one technically held authority to do so. The protocols were inherited, not reviewed. The bunker existed in a legal and ethical shadow, maintained out of inertia rather than intent. No single individual could be held accountable, because no single individual had ever fully owned the decision. That diffusion was a design. It ensured that when the consequences surfaced decades later, there would be no one left to answer for them. The people who had approved the doctrine were gone. The committees dissolved. The language outdated. The system remained, quietly enforcing rules no one remembered agreeing to. The disappearance, reframed through this lens, was not a mystery. It was a byproduct, a cost calculated so long ago that it no longer registered as such. The men's lives were weighed against an abstract notion of risk and found expendable, not out of cruelty, but out of detachment. This understanding offered no comfort. It did not restore what was lost. It did not provide justice in any meaningful sense. It only revealed the scale of the mechanism that had made their erasure possible, a mechanism that did not see itself as evil, because it did not see itself as human at all. The truth buried for decades, was not that something went wrong that night. It was that nothing did. After the bunker was opened and its existence acknowledged, quietly, carefully, without spectacle, the world did not change in any obvious way. There were no public apologies, no memorials erected in sudden recognition, no officials standing before cameras to accept responsibility. The truth emerged, but it did so the way it had always existed, partially obscured, softened by distance, filtered through language designed to minimize impact. The facility remained operational. New reports were filed. New classifications applied. The bunker was cataloged, its contents documented, its purpose described in terms vague enough to satisfy oversight without provoking outrage. It became an historical structure, a legacy installation, a thing of the past, safely contained in binders and databases. For the families, the reopening of the case brought a strange kind of relief and an even stranger kind of pain. They were given answers, but not the kind they had imagined over the years. There was no final moment to picture, no last words to hold on to. Instead, there was an explanation that reframed everything they thought they knew, revealing that the disappearance had not been chaos or misfortune, but design. Some found comfort in finally knowing. Others found the knowledge unbearable. To understand that the men had not been forgotten, but deliberately absorbed into a system that valued silence over life, was a truth that resisted acceptance. Grief, once shaped by uncertainty, now had edges again, sharp ones. The question of justice lingered, unresolved. Investigations were reopened briefly, then closed again. Statutes of limitation were cited, jurisdictional complexities invoked. The events, it was determined, belonged to a different era, governed by policies that no longer existed. Accountability dissolved into history. There would be no trials, no names formally condemned. The truth was acknowledged, but it was not acted upon. In the months that followed, the bunker was sealed once more, not erased this time, but secured. Its entrance reinforced, access restricted. It became a place that could be referenced but not revisited freely. Knowledge, once uncovered, was again controlled. Above ground, life continued its quiet momentum. New guards walked the perimeter, their footsteps echoing those who came before. Radios crackled, logs were filled. The patrol route remained, altered just enough to avoid the area beneath which the bunker lay. No one said why. They didn't have to. The story circulated, but only in fragments. It appeared in investigative articles that never quite reached mainstream attention, in academic discussions about institutional secrecy, in conversations among those who already distrusted systems that operated without transparency. For most people, it remained distant, too complex, too abstract, too unsettling to dwell on. But absence has a way of persisting. At the facility, some claim the atmosphere changed. Not dramatically, not in ways that could be measured, but subtly. Radio seemed quieter. The low hum beneath the ground felt more pronounced, as if the earth itself remembered what had been disturbed. These observations were dismissed as imagination, as the mind's attempt to impose meaning where none existed. Still, they were shared. For the families, life settled into a new equilibrium. The question that had dominated decades of their existence was finally answered, but it did not resolve itself into peace. Instead, it transformed. They no longer asked where the men were. They asked what it meant to live in a world where such systems could exist, unseen and unchallenged. What it meant to trust institutions built on inherited authority rather than ongoing accountability. What it meant that the truth could surface and still change so little. Some chose to speak publicly. They told the story not as a mystery, but as a warning, about how easily human lives can become variables, about how language can sanitize harm, about how the absence of visible violence does not mean the absence of cruelty. Others remained silent, not out of fear, but out of fatigue. The story had taken enough from them. They did not owe it anything more. The men themselves remained elusive, even in truth. They were still known mostly through reports, recollections, and the small details preserved by those who loved them. The chipped mug, the worn notebook, the routines that ended without explanation. These fragments carried more humanity than any official document ever could. In remembering them, something became clear. They were not exceptional in the way stories often demand their subjects be. They were not heroes or martyrs in the traditional sense. They were ordinary people who trusted the systems they served, who followed the paths laid out for them, who disappeared not because they were reckless, but because they were compliant. That was the haunting part. The bunker revealed a truth that extended beyond its concrete walls. It exposed a logic that still existed, even if its most extreme manifestations were hidden. A logic that prioritized continuity over conscience, procedure over people. The doors had been opened, but what lay behind them could not be undone. And so the story ended not with closure, but with awareness, with the understanding that some truths once uncovered do not resolve into endings. They linger. They ask to be carried forward, not as mysteries, but as lessons. The patrol never returned. Decades later, the truth did. And even then, it came too late to save anyone, leaving behind only the echo of footsteps that stopped one night and a question that will never fully rest. How many other stories are still buried, waiting for time to fail for getting them too?